Hello everyone, welcome back to Rule the Roost podcast. Ding dong, the witch is dead. Antonio Conte has left. Hallelujah. Hello Dan Kilpatrick of the Evening Standard and the Tottenham Way podcast. How are you doing, mate?
Hello Jack, very well thanks. Yourself?
Yeah, I'm all good, mate. Thank you for giving me your time today, as you have prefaced this by saying I'm extremely busy today. And I can imagine that you are. Can you give us just some sort of idea as to what's going on in general in the world of Dan, but also in the world of Tottenham right now?
Well, I've done the paper, that's the main thing. So the timing of the announcement could have been better for us. Obviously, you kind of want these things to drop at like 8 a.m. when you work for the Standard. Then you can get it in the paper with plenty of time. But obviously, it surprised everyone at about 20 past 10 last night. So I think the national papers will have been scrambling around to get that in their second editions and probably been very unhappy with the club for announcing it when they did. Slightly better for me, but gave me a kind of sleepless night to worry about what I was going to do today. But that's done, and then I think an afternoon of hopefully making calls, maybe trying to find out a bit about Stellini and Mason, find out what I can, and perhaps start thinking about profiles of Nagelsmann and some of the other bosses in the frame, because we don't know how quickly that's going to move now. I imagine it might be a case of waiting till the summer, as happened the last time a temporary manager came in. That was obviously Mason after Mourinho, but you never know. There's no timeline from what I'm told on an appointment, so Spurs could be working on it now with a view to appointing someone and naming someone before the end of the season. There's a lot up in the air at the moment. I am on holiday from Wednesday. I'm dog sitting, just sort of locally, but I'm off work, so I'm hoping it's kind of nothing happens in the latter half of this week.
You're not going to get the old Alistair Gold curse of something big happening whilst you're on holiday.
It's amazing how that's become a thing. It does seem to be a strange coincidence, but no, I really hope that doesn't happen to me.
You were talking about the timing of the announcement. It was obviously quite bizarre. I mean, 10:20 p.m. on a Sunday evening. Is there any idea as to why it was at that time? Why the club kind of rushed it out like that?
Yes. So my understanding is that was literally when the agreement was reached between Conte and I believe it was Levy, who was leading the talks externally. He wasn't in Italy. They were doing it remotely. And that was literally when the agreement was reached. The ink was, the proverbial ink was basically drying on the deal when the club announced that. I think there was a feeling that it wouldn't hold. I'm not for a minute suggesting that Conte would have called Di Marzio or Fabio Romano or someone, but that was presumably what the club was thinking, and they thought it wouldn't really hold overnight. So they announced it as soon as it was agreed.
You've just written a piece, and everybody is free to go and read that either in print or on the Evening Standard's website at the moment about what's kind of led to this place. But can you give us some idea, just in sort of summary, as to what has happened here? Because there has been radio silence for a while, right? I think even a few of us were hopeful - worried that he would be coming back, that somehow him and Levy would just see through this, that they'd put everything aside and power on till the end of the season and hopefully get top four again and then say goodbye in the summer. But obviously what has happened now. Can you give us any sort of insight into that, sort of some of the stuff you touched on in your latest piece?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to give the impression that I know exactly what was happening last week, because I think the surprising thing about last week and the kind of week after the Southampton game was just how little anyone knew. That's reporters and kind of people, myself and my colleagues were speaking to or trying to speak to. No one really had an idea what was going on. It was striking how little kind of information there was out there, and as you said, the radio silence coming from the club. It felt like Levy was working, under the utmost secrecy and trying to get something done. And it was a strange sense of limbo where I think everyone expected Conte to be sacked. No one expected him to take charge of the Everton game, and yet it was completely unclear what was going to happen. The impression I get from conversations kind of this morning is that obviously the club felt there was no massive rush given it was the international break and the players were all away, barring a handful of kind of young players and sort of injured senior players. I think there's an impression that the start of the international break is a great time to bring in a new manager because they can bed in. But if Spurs had appointed someone last Monday, they would have been basically working with Brandon Austin and Lucas Moura. So there wasn't a huge rush to make a change. And the impression I get is that Levy has been considering his options, using that time to basically work out what to do next. The options being potentially continue with Conte. For reasons I'll get onto, I don't think that was really ever tenable on either side. Put a temporary manager in place, be it Mason with his own coaching staff, like Michel Vorm, as happened when Mourinho was sacked until the end of the season, or this unprecedented situation of basically continuing with Conte's coaching staff without Conte, which was obviously the one they've settled on. Or of course get a permanent manager in immediately. So those were kind of the options, and then there was the question of agreeing once it was decided that Conte couldn't or wouldn't remain, then there was the question of kind of agreeing the terms of his exit, which anyone who knows anything about Conte will know that won't have been easy. He really dug his heels in at Chelsea. There was a kind of absurd situation at Chelsea where he spent all summer talking about his exit, but then had to come back, I think, and do the start of pre-season for them because it hadn't been agreed. So I was kind of wondering if there'd be a similar situation where Conte kind of appeared on Wednesday, took one training session, and then left, which would have been an absolute disaster. So I think that's what's been going on really. And in terms of why the decision they came to was made, I think there was a very strong feeling that Conte had completely lost the dressing room and that there was no coming back from what he said at Southampton. I think the club kind of accepted his explanation that he wasn't talking about Levy and the club at St Mary's, he was talking about the players. And there was an acknowledgement from what I've heard that Conte has used that kind of approach in the past, notably after the Burnley defeat last season, where he kind of went strong to motivate the players, but there was just an acceptance on this occasion that it wasn't going to motivate them, and that he had torched his relationship with the squad. There was no going back, and he wasn't going to get top four if he was kind of made to come back. I think on Conte's side as well, he didn't really have an appetite to come back from Italy. I think he was done. So that's why the club couldn't continue with him, and I think they would have liked to have appointed a permanent manager, or certainly considered it, but they've kind of settled on this strange and unprecedented situation. I think with the feeling that Stellini is a kind of intriguing mixture of continuity and change, really. Continuity in that he knows the players, he's done a little spell in the job, should be able to hit the ground running and not need a period of adaptation. Change in that he'll now be able to be his own man, potentially deviate from Conte's training methods, his preparation methods, his man management, his tactics, his subs, all that kind of stuff, and do things a little bit differently. The danger, of course, is that he's just the continuity Conte without the strong rhetoric, I think.
It always seems hugely contentious to, in any way, defend Daniel Levy or ENIC or just the club as a concept. But do you know if there's any kind of feeling of, I don't know, the club feeling somehow let down or disappointed by Conte and how things have panned out? Because from my perspective, I mean, I know people have been very quick to say a lot of what Conte was saying was true. It's hard truth. Spurs need to hear it. I still think it was just disgraceful, his press conference, at least from a fan's perspective watching that. And this sort of prevailing narrative that the club haven't backed him. Like Barney Ronay just said a thing for The Guardian the other day saying that, Spurs were expecting Conte not to be Conte and Conte was expecting Spurs not to be Spurs. But I don't think that's at all true. I think Tottenham have bent to Conte's will, massively so. And the fact he's kind of continually seemingly thrown that all back in the club's face as well. Has that created any sort of... Are they quite surprised by how he's been? Disappointed?
I think if you look at Daniel Levy's statement or paragraph of quotes accompanying the announcement that Conte was leaving last night. That tells you all you need to know about the relationship between the two. I mean, compare it to Levy's statement when Mourinho left the club. I've retweeted someone who has put those two statements side by side. If anyone wants to have a look on my timeline, the tweet was by Oliver Young-Miles of the I newspaper, who compared Levy's statement after Conte left and his statement after Mourinho left. He makes no mention of Conte whatsoever. Last night, when Mourinho left, he said, on a personal level, I've enjoyed working with him and regret that things have not worked out as we both envisaged. He will always be welcome here, and we should like to thank him and his coaching staff for their contribution.
And this was of Mourinho?
This is of Mourinho.
Okay.
He also said, Jose is a true professional who showed enormous resilience during the pandemic. That was what Levy said after Mourinho left. Not even a mention of Conte. So I think we can, you can read between the lines there and work out how the club felt in the end. On the question of kind of backing, I slightly disagree with you. I've done a piece, a kind of post-mortem piece of Conte's tenure, but I focus particularly on the question of whether he was backed. I think that is the question that will kind of divide supporters, so I wanted to get into it in a bit of detail. I mean, my view on it is that he was clearly backed more than any other manager Levy has employed. I think he was unwilling. He was less willing to compromise than the club, undoubtedly. But I don't think the club went all out to give him the tools he needed to do the job. When you hire a manager like Conte, it's absolutely pointless in not giving him every possible tool that you can. But I think that was understandable. You know, Levy was not willing to go all out for a manager who wouldn't commit to the club long term. Conte was not willing to give an inch. So I kind of agree with Barney's assessment that you just mentioned. I haven't read his piece, but I think both parties should have known better. It was obviously a marriage that wasn't going to work. Conte should have known that Spurs were not going to spend hundreds of millions of pounds and buy, the experienced winners that he wanted. Spurs should have known that Conte was not going to be the type of manager to compromise, to accept club signings, and to be willing to build over a period of time, which is what you need to do in the Premier League now.
How have you found him, like professionally speaking? Because I think I've referenced it several times on this podcast. It was actually you, wasn't it, that triggered him in the Southampton rant, really? And I'm not saying you were doing anything provocative. You were just asking him a fairly straightforward question, literally on this point, I believe, about his lack of commitment to the club, perhaps creating this situation that we're in right now. And then that's when he flew off the handle about alibis, right?
Yeah. So he'd already begun the rant, and I started to ask him if he felt his situation and his future had unsettled the players, and he kind of didn't let me finish the question, knew where I was going, and started talking about the excuses and alibis. So I don't want to kind of insert myself into the story, but that was.
I've done that for you, mate. It's all right.
Yeah, that was what I was trying to ask him. Yeah, because I certainly. I think there was clearly some truth in what he said. Certainly the bit about the culture of the club has been said by too many different managers now to not be true. But I also think the point about mentality and club culture has been massively overblown by Conte, and that it would be far less of a factor, perhaps not a factor at all, if Spurs had employed a progressive coach who wanted to be there, who was willing to play modern football on the front foot, who wanted to coach players and improve them, not sign new players all the time, and all the things I think, all the failings I think Conte was ultimately guilty of. So in terms of how I've found dealing with him, he's been pretty good. He's normally kind of quite relaxed in press conferences, apart from when he's flying off the handle. He sticks to pretty set messages all the time. He can be quite repetitive, but he's been good value. He's been blockbuster. But personally, I I think I've made my feelings fairly clear in a couple of pieces I've written recently. I think a lot of what he said has been hypocritical and a means of deflecting from his own failings. I mean, to say the players don't play for the badge when he has consistently acted like Spurs are completely beneath him and refused to commit to the club before the end of the season, it seems to me to be just a height of hypocrisy. How can you accuse the players of not being committed when you yourself have spent the entire 17 months in charge, acting as though you're just waiting for a better job to come along?
I think there'd be a few of them as well that his comments about these lot aren't used to playing in big games would be saying, well, we were in a Champions League final a couple of years ago, mate. When have you last been there?
Well, quite. I mean,
as a manager at least.
Yeah, I mean, saying after the AC Milan game that Spurs suggesting that Spurs couldn't compete with AC Milan because of their respective histories in the Champions League, when Tottenham's history in the Champions League is far superior to Conte's as a manager. Conte's only ever won one Champions League knockout game against Celtic. Spurs have won 4, I think. AC Milan under Harry, and then obviously Man City, Dortmund and Ajax under Pochettino. So Spurs have a much better record at winning Champions League knockout games than Conte. So perhaps it was his history that cost them against Milan. It was things like that eventually grated on me, and I felt needed calling out. But as I said, that there's clearly some truth in what he was saying, because he's not the first person to say that, and he may well not be the last. But I do think his line of criticism was just massively overblown and would have just been less of a factor if he was desperate to be there and had more of an affinity with the club and was kind of coaching them in the right way.
Well, that's it, because it's part of the problem of having a manager that's contract is winding down, right? He's always going to revert back into self-preservation mode. He's going to be thinking about the next job, and thus it's easier to throw Tottenham under the bus and use the typical Tottenham archetypes, if you like, as to why it would be impossible for him to achieve success. But please, Real Madrid, don't forget about me type. It's this is why the whole issue's arisen, and this is why the vagueness around his future is ultimately just been so destructive. My opinion, anyway. But we sort of, you touched on the players being unhappy, because I'd imagine a lot of them would have been very unhappy at that. From your sense of how things are, is it a literal kind of lost the dressing room type thing? It's a fairly undivided opinion on the matter with regard to him, because I would imagine, given that Spurs seem to be, the noises we hear anyway, seemingly wanting to turn Harry Kane into this Mbappe type director of football within the club, his sort of opinion would have mattered on this type of thing, right?
That. Yeah, I mean, the opinion of senior players, I think, always matters. Yeah, I mean, the impression I got, and again, a piece I've written for the paper today, is that Spurs ultimately felt they had no choice but to agree the terms of Conte's exit because he had completely lost the dressing room. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to sort of work out why. If you look at what he actually was saying at Southampton, that was a direct attack on the players' characters and professionalism. He made a point of saying it's not about kind of how good they are as players or their ability to follow my directions. It's about their kind of mindsets. He was essentially calling them poor professionals and weak characters, and that's a pretty stinging criticism to take. So I think,
other than that, good bunch of lads, though.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as an aside, the strange thing about that is Conte had consistently gone out of his way to make a point about the players being great men. He said many times, despite not being the best players, and he even said last season they were the best group of players he'd ever worked with. So again, he was so up and down, and I think a big part of what he said at St Mary's was the fact that he just can't bear not winning, and kind of just explodes when results are going against him. I don't necessarily think that he genuinely thinks the players are all a bunch of losers. But yeah, I do think that there was just no coming back from what he said. I mean, speaking to one source earlier, he was saying a lot of the players were basically going off for international duty, quite pleased at the prospect of never having to see him again because they all thought he was going to be sacked. So I alluded to that in my piece today. I think, having said that, I remember before the Southampton game, I remember speaking to someone. In fact, this was before the AC Milan game, so before it kind of went south. That there were definitely still players at that point who quite liked, who respected Conte at least. So it would be wrong to say that he, as recently as kind of a few weeks ago, he didn't still have the respect for some players in the dressing room. But I do think a majority, certainly after the Southampton game, had just completely had enough of his methods and his rhetoric and particularly his tendency to publicly slam them.
Which is understandable, really, isn't it? It's because this stuff, it's already kind of, in certain circles of the fan base I'm seeing anyway, getting twisted into, well, that's the problem. The club always stick by these players, and how many managers are they going to do this to? And as much as I can kind of side with that to an extent. The squad is still being refreshed. There's a lot of new players here. I mean, Pedro Porro didn't seem overly glowing of him when he did that piece with The Guardian, and he's a brand new signing, pretty much signed for Conte. So it's...
Yeah, but I mean, in one of the points I made in my piece, my obituary piece, is that even as recently as the Southampton game, even in Conte's last game, when we saw Porro kind of burst into space and smash it into the roof of the net to open the scoring, you did wonder, hold on a minute, that's Conte with a proper right wing back, and he has not. We can argue about Spence and his treatment of Spence was one of the many things that I think underlined his intractability and his unwillingness to compromise, which was part of his downfall. But ultimately, had the club really committed to having Conte as the manager, you could have made a case that January 2022, the top priority should have been 2 proper wing backs. And the only wing back the club have signed who Conte really wanted was a free agent, 33 years old from the Serie A, who hasn't worked out. And we can blame Conte for that possibly, but even watching Porro, I did think, well, hold on, how different might his reign have been if he had a few more of the tools that he clearly needed, because he just wasn't ever going to change formation. It was just such a moot point wondering if he might go to 4-2-3-1. It was never going to happen.
Had we brought in Udoji earlier, something like that as well on top, right?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, just I completely understand why the club didn't do it, because to sign 2 specialist wing backs in January last year for a manager who was not committing beyond the end of the season would have been a big risk. So Conte was partly to blame for creating this uncertainty. Everything would have been so different if he had a 3-year contract and was kind of willing to commit to a project. Spurs perhaps would have gone into the market and said, okay, you can have 2 young, up and coming wing backs. They didn't, and I did, wonder how different things might have been. I think the defence again. I mean, it does feel to me pretty inexcusable that he was, like Mourinho before him, often relying on kind of 4 relics of the Pochettino era in Davis, Sanchez, Dyer and Tanganga, who I think it's fair to say, by the end of Pochettino's era, it was kind of pretty clear that those guys were not players you could rely on every week to play for an elite club, and yet they were still there under Conte. So there were areas where I did have sympathy for him in that respect.
Going forwards, Dan, what's we've got Stellini in place. I mean, we can only speculate as to the reasons why this has occurred, but it is what it is, right? Fabio Peretti, has he got a hearing today? I believe it was a hearing to decide whether or not his proceedings are going to just be purely sporting or criminal
Apparently
ones.
It's been postponed. Yeah,
oh, right.
DiMarzio said it's been postponed. I mean, he's definitely facing an uncertain future. I think that's fair to say.
And I would say with him being so tethered to Conte, it's probably not a great look for him now, right, within the club. With that stuff aside, the kind of contentious legal issues aside.
I think the idea that Peretti is completely tied to Conte is a little bit misleading. It was Levy who appointed Conte, not Peretti. And I don't know if Peretti and Conte are as close as it's made out. Certainly Peretti was the point of contact for Conte with the club, and they had a working relationship. But I don't think it was necessarily a case that they're kind of, they were super close, put it that way. But Peretti's position definitely feels a lot more unstable now. Obviously, if he's banned from working in Europe, he won't be able to continue at Spurs. And I guess a lot depends on who Spurs want for the job and who they sort of settle on to try and get, because Pochettino, for instance, has worked well under directors of football, but also hasn't enjoyed working under others. There's a feeling that maybe him and Peretti wouldn't be able to work together. Poch liked to be the kind of guy running the training ground, and at the moment that's Peretti. He's down there watching training most days, cycling around the Hotspur way, being a very big presence there, and that was kind of the job Poch had when he was in charge. So I don't know whether the club's big enough for both of them, for instance. I don't know enough about Nagelsmann, for instance, to say whether he'd want to work with Peretti or under a director of football. There's kind of big decisions now on the direction the club goes.
Because I think there's always been that worry, at least it started to develop over the past few years. It's one I very much share, that the club have taken the decision to appoint, should we say, these superstar managers, Mourinho, Conte, without much thought to the legacy or the strategy, the overall strategy of the club, what the club wants to be. Daniel Levy's given a fairly sort of like nebulous press statement before about maintaining our heritage and our DNA, but then going and appointing Antonio Conte several weeks later, which I guess was seen as an exciting move by many people, and I think we all tried to embrace it as best we could. But I think it was fairly clear from the start that it wasn't, he wasn't really what Tottenham fans like to. Well, yeah, exactly, a good fit. What we like to kind of see our club emboldening on the pitch and stuff is not usually echoed in his style of football. The fact that the club haven't just maybe rushed in and gotten somebody like Enrique, for example, who you would say fits that kind of borderline superstar manager mould, available right now, but again, there's question marks over his football, or at least how it would work in the Premier League or at Tottenham. Do you think that sort of shows that the club really do probably realise that they actually have to really think about this next move, get it right? Or is it just simply that we've just had to get Conte out because we don't want this to continue and we may well go and get Enrique next week?
Well, I mean, everyone, as I recall, was kind of suggesting that Conte was the last throw of the dice for Levy. If you remember back in November 2021, I remember people saying, well, this is a great appointment, exciting appointment, but Levy can't get this wrong. And yet, kind of here we are, 17 months later, and he's preparing to pick a 12th permanent Spurs manager. So it's just a kind of another last chance for the board, really, isn't it? But they could keep on getting last chances until they're no longer in charge. But yeah, I mean, clearly Levy is in a sort of stickier spot now than I think he's ever been at Spurs. He's got a succession of huge problems coming down the track. He's got to get the next manager right. He's got the Peretti situation, which could be out of his hands. He's got Kane's future to resolve, which could be very messy again in the summer. And then he's got growing unrest in the fan base, which is linked to all those decisions. If Mason and Stellini don't do particularly well, then you could see the atmosphere in the last 10 games being really, really sour. So yeah, there's a lot on his plate, and I've sort of forgotten what your question was.
Just do you feel that the club are actually kind of going to think about a bigger kind of tactical approach to the appointment, what it means for the entire club going forwards? If we think about Pochettino, he was somebody that emboldened a real sense of belief within the club, and had them punching way above their kind of weight in a sense. It felt sustainable, right? As opposed to now we've just had Mourinho and Conte, and we're just buying players to try and fit this win now manager thing. But we as you've said at the top, we're never going to be the club that's going to really go out and buy. We weren't going to buy Casemiro, for example, for whatever United pay 50, 60 mil for a 30-year-old.
Yeah, no, completely. I mean, this strategy over the last 17 months has been nothing really beyond having Antonio Conte as manager. That's seemingly been the only real long-term vision for Spurs, is just having a big name, title-winning manager in charge. And now the lack of a plan is reflected in the situation we're in now. You know, you look at Brighton, for example. When they lost Potter, they clearly had a short list of managers who fitted the club's ethos. They went out and got one, and they've got even better. That is not true of Spurs. Levy does not have, as it stands, a proper vision for the club, and hasn't for a number of years on the football side. I think that's obvious. He's made a sort of series of pretty disastrous decisions, dating back to not backing Pochettino properly. So yeah, it does feel like the next appointment will say a lot about just the direction of the club in general. You know, if Spurs went for a kind of De Zerbi, or De Zerbi himself, or someone in a similar vein, it would be obvious that they're thinking about building over the medium to long term. Alternatively, if they're going for a kind of, I don't know, maybe Enrique, that might suggest that they're committed to this approach of having more of a big name in the dugout, who can potentially aim for trophies immediately. So I think there's a lot of big decisions coming down the tracks for the club this summer, particularly for Levy, and it's probably fair to say it's his most crucial period as chairman.
Thank you very much for your time this afternoon, Dan Kilpatrick. When you're not doing your job for the Evening Standard, people can listen to you on the Phoenix from the Flames that is the Tottenham Way podcast. You've got a few episodes of that out now. When's that go out, and who's on it?
Yeah, so we relaunched the pod. We're trying to take a kind of bigger picture look at Spurs, and get into some big issues rather than reacting to sort of every game, which I just don't have the bandwidth for anymore. It's too exhausting, or at least it was under Conte. Trying to dissect another game that felt exactly the same as the one before. So we try and record one every week. I think we're going to try and do one tonight or tomorrow on the Conte Stellini situation. So yeah, please do give us a follow and listen. I appreciate there are a lot of Spurs podcasts out there, some very good ones, including this one. But I hope we're doing something a little bit different that will kind of interest people.